Late that year, Richard traveled to my home in Northern California to familiarize himself with my natural sound archive, and he came away with a cornucopia of rich ideas. Neither of us had ever collaborated on the writing of a symphony before, but with Richard's scoring background and my wildlife sound contributions, he was able to bring both the soundscapes and the music inspired by them to a new level and a new model of sound art, returning us once again to the moment when music was first conceived. Do enjoy the program.
It's a great pleasure and an honor to be here today. I have a feeling the beginning of Bernie's message maybe was truncated, but anyway, I think you get the gist of it. And it's a real pleasure for me to be here listening to the Raleigh Civic Symphony Orchestra under their excellent conductor, Peter Askin. In 2012, I heard a BBC radio broadcast of extracts of Bernie Krause's book, The Great Animal Orchestra. Bernie Krause is the foremost bio-musician, recordist, who's actually collected an archive of over 5,000 recordings of animals over some 40 years. And his book, The Great Animal Orchestra, describes some of his adventures and how he traveled the world and recorded animals in the desert, in rainforests, in the ocean, in the air, every possible way of actually recording animals using hydrophones, special microphones developed for recording insects, and so on. And not only did an actor read extracts from Bernie's book, but there were recordings, extracts of his recordings, which I listened to. And when I heard the sound of gibbons singing in their wonderful swooping call in the Borneo rainforest in the early morning, I was hooked. And I thought how wonderful it would be to try to develop an orchestral symphony in which we could incorporate those recordings. So I got in touch with Bernie, and he very generously said, well, come to San Francisco and let's talk about it. And the first thing that we spoke about was how on earth is it possible to actually incorporate those sounds with a symphony orchestra. I didn't want to simply have tape playback somewhere in the distance and the orchestra plays along. I wanted to be more ambitious than that. And from my background in film scoring, I know how it's possible to actually sample sounds and to transfer them onto a keyboard. So this is exactly what we did, and we experimented in California with some 150 samples, taking them and actually putting them onto a keyboard so that when you press F sharp doesn't come out, but a gorilla comes out. Or E flat and a frog comes out. And this means that with a live keyboard player, which we have this evening, this gentleman over there on the electronic keyboard, he has complete control of the sounds that he's creating, which means that he can play in perfect tempo with a flute, with a log drum, with a whatever it might be. And so that opened up so many possibilities for the composition. And then in the course of the next 2 years, I came backwards and forwards to California, and Bernie came over to London to visit me, and we developed this weird and strange idea for a piece called The Great Animal Orchestra Symphony. And the piece is in 5 movements. I'll briefly tell you what the movements are and the kind of stories that we try to tell in the movements, because in observing the natural world, it became clear that there were certain things that were very important. Obviously, mating is very important. The way animals communicate a sense of danger to protect themselves. Play is extremely important. And there are 2 scherzo movements, 2 movements about play in this piece. And there's also, right in the center of it, an elegy. Bernie recorded a beaver whose dam. Its home had been blown up by rangers, and its mate and its cubs had been killed, and this lone beaver was just circling round and round, uttering this mournful cry. Bernie had recorded beavers before, but he'd never heard anything like that, and he said it was the saddest sound he'd ever heard. And so I created an elegy around that idea to illustrate the tragedy of so many wild species that are uprooted or destroyed by mankind. So the opening movement, we did have a slide. I don't know if it's available, and I can actually show you what there it is. It looks like somebody's had a bad tooth removed, but anyway, Bernie showed me that not only can you play these wonderful sounds, but you can actually watch them on a spectrogram. And this is a spectrogram, and this is the Borneo rainforest, which you're going to hear in the very first movement. And Bernie said, Richard, it's not enough for you to just write this from the comfort of your home in London. You've got to get out to the rainforest and actually hear these incredible symphonies of sound yourself. And that's exactly what I did. So on the spectrogram, at the very, very top, you can see just in purple, even beyond that top line, bats, which you can't even hear. Below that, you hear crickets. Below that, you hear frogs. Below that, you hear birds. And those yellow lines at the bottom are the gibbons actually calling to one another. So the first movement opens with hearing filtered in these sounds from Bernie's recording, exactly in its virgin state, without any music. And then little by little, the orchestra actually joins in and does effectively what the recording is doing. You hear the violins very, very high up, and then little by little, the lower instruments, the middle instruments, and the low grumbling basses and contrabassoons. And when Bernie showed me that, he said, this is like the page of an orchestral score. Broadly speaking, flutes at the top, horns in the middle, basses at the bottom. This is the great animal orchestra. And I was inspired by his words, and so the first movement is an introduction to this idea, and it's like a grand tuning up of the whole idea of the great animal orchestra. Second movement is great fun. It's one of the play movements, and it begins with frogs. And not only can you sample individual animals, as well as whole textures of animals, but a frog might go like that. So on one note we've got on the other note we've got and that means that when he plays them together, he can actually play a frog in perfect tempo. And then that gets to be joined by woodblocks and various other percussion, and the whole orchestra joins in for a giant jam session. The third movement, as I mentioned, is the elegy. It starts with something very, very curious. Bernie played me a wonderful recording of wolves, Algonquin wolves, and he said, listen how these wolves actually sing in close part harmony. And they do, it's just the most extraordinary sound. And so I decided to add to the wolves a pack of French horns, there they are, just sitting at the back there, playing in clusters. And sometimes you can't tell what's French horn and what is wolf, and that's one of the exciting things, creating new textures using Bernie's recordings and natural instruments. The fourth movement is about massive animals, elephants and gorillas, and you hear these extraordinary sub-bass sounds of elephants, and the deepest members of the orchestra join in with them, and it ends with a charge of gorillas. Bernie was recording once, and because he had his headphones on and his microphone pointing in your direction, he couldn't hear that behind him a gorilla was coming up to him and finally seized him, threw him up in the air, and he broke 3 ribs and most of his recording equipment. So the danger and the violence of the natural world as well is something that's depicted there. In the final movement, almost the star of the show, is a bird from the Amazon called the musician wren, who amazingly sings a 44-note melody. And after she sung it, she goes back to the beginning and she sings all 44 notes again and again. And nearby, in Bernie's recording, there was a parrot sitting on a branch who obviously had had enough of the wren's call. And you hear the parrot going, wah, 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 In other words, give us a break. And so the wren stops, and then she goes back and she sings the same 44 notes again. We decided not to have a parrot, but there was another instrument called a common patoo, which sings a perfect 5-note scale, the pentatonic scale, and we know about that because in Peru, where it comes from, they have a little instrument called an ocarina, probably you know about it, and it's exactly the same 5 notes and sounds the same as the common patoo. So you'll hear this wonderful bird interrupted by a common patoo along with the first trombone. Anyway, our piece, we hope, is a celebration of the natural world, its diversity, and the collaboration with Bernie Krause was an incredible pleasure. It's one of those collaborations where you end up with a close friend as well as a collaborator. And since then, we've written the ballet together, which has been done in San Francisco. So I do hope you'll enjoy the Great Animal Orchestra, played by these wonderful musicians. Thank you so much.